Okay, welcome everybody. Appreciate you coming out here on a Sunday afternoon. My name is Bruce Patton. I'm the Director of Curatorial Services here at Savoy, which basically means curator, so much easier to say. Anybody here for the first time? Oh, that's good. Well, welcome. Appreciate you coming. Anybody go to the Caffeine and Octane show? All right, yeah, that was great. Happy the weather, cooperated for that show. So what I'd like to do is just kind of go through a few slides to talk about the museum and kind of our current exhibitions. Hopefully you got a chance to go look at those out there because we have some that are getting ready to change over. Hopefully you saw the Quiet Greatness, the Japanese collectible cars. We have the Savoy Survivors, which are getting ready to leave as of tonight. And then we have the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum. Those are winners through the decades. Those are all cars that won at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway at the Indy 500. And those will only be here till the end of the month. So please make sure you get to see those. And then we have our Savoy collection. But what we're here to talk about is supercars. So we're really excited to have Ed here to talk about that. If you look on our website, you'll see what we have planned for 2025. These are all the exhibits. So you can see there's 12 different exhibits that we have planned for 2025. So please go on there and check those out. The other thing I wanted to mention was we also have movies here in the theater. So if you're a member, you can come. It's part of your membership package. You can come and see a different movie each month. And so the next one to come up is the Tokyo Drift. So we wanted to tie it together with the Japanese collectibles. So you can come, I think that's next week, so Friday. So again, look through the schedule. Also wanted to thank Styles Auto Care. So their sponsorship helps put these programs on so that we can have these programs for you guys. So I'd like to thank them again. And now I'd like to bring out Ed. So Ed Bolian, many of you know, one of the founders of VinWiki. So, thanks, Ed. Really appreciate you coming.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Ed Bolian. I own a company called VinWiki, and one of my cars is out there in the museum on the supercar display. And so we're going to talk a little bit about supercars for the next little bit. We'll leave some time for Q&A, and I'll call a couple of the other owners up here in a few minutes to talk about their cars as well. But first, I just want to say how cool it is that we're getting to talk about supercars in one of the world's foremost automotive museums here at Savoy, because making automotive content as a job, I get to go to automotive events all around the world, and inevitably, people ask me, how do we get more kids like you to come to these events? Which has a lot of problems with it, right? And so certainly I am not the kids we're looking for, but a lot of these old Concours events and these events that are just, the most important parts of American car culture in many ways are noticing a very aging audience, and they ask me, well, how do we get younger people excited? And the answer is supercars. And they're all like, well, yeah, what about how do we make them love our pre-war cars and our muscle cars and our hot rods and things like that? I said, well, you got to get your foot in the door. And so Amelia Island had a supercar class a couple of years ago, and then they scrapped that. And then Hilton Head did, and they scrapped that. And so, it seems like everyone's trying to understand exactly why supercars are so important right now, especially over the past decade, to the automotive world at large. And the coolest thing about supercars within the automotive hobby is really that they kind of exhibit this superlative nature, not unlike a chef's tasting menu at a Michelin 3-star restaurant, or the greatest butler service at the world's best 5-star resort in the Maldives, or a couture fashion line in Milan, or you don't need to understand the triangle offense in order to appreciate Blake Griffin dunking a basketball. So the NBA slam dunk contest is kind of like supercars are to the world of cars. And I think that's where we can really start to understand the allure in where the genesis for so many of us is as we fall in love with cars. Because for me and a lot of people that are 30 to 50 years old in particular, there was something in automotive media, in a movie, in something that we experienced where we were introduced to the love of cars through a supercar. I was recently on a Haggerty documentary about the opening scene of Cannonball Run. And I think there's a whole lot of people, myself included, that can attribute at least a big part of our love for cars to that opening scene of a gorgeous black Lamborghini Countach blasting across the desert, two gorgeous women in spandex getting out of it, spray painting on a speed limit sign, waving at the cops, and then running off into the distance. And I think there's just so much about Seth's Countach and all of the Lamborghinis that we see and love today that we can just point back to those kind of positive memories. But you know, a supercar can be a very, very challenging thing to really put a definition on. And even as a car enthusiast, it's kind of pretty easy to fall back on more of a Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart definition of pornography that I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. But it helps as we start to understand the nature of supercars to have sort of a working definition of what we think. And clearly it is a preponderance of various ideas and characteristics that a car might have. But it's not just one thing. I mean, obviously there's a performance characteristic, but a Nissan GTR and a Corvette Z06 probably aren't supercars. Obviously there's a rarity of value and an exclusivity component, but a Rolls-Royce and most Bentleys wouldn't be considered supercars. Obviously there's a beauty and an aesthetic element of something that makes it really, really moving and attractive, but you know, a Jaguar E-Type and a Duesenberg probably aren't supercars, even though they might have been in their moment. Now, and that's really where it's important to understand that the word supercar is not something that was used all that often more than about 15 to 20 years ago. In fact, two of the cars that are out there on the display, the Ferrari 288 GTO and the Ferrari F50, were some of the first cars that were like canonically defined as supercars, because at their times when it was either, you know, a 308, 355, 360, a normal mid-engine V8 Ferrari, that we would now, their more contemporary cars, we'd call them supercars. If you went supercar shopping today, you'd be going to look at a McLaren 750 and a Lamborghini Huracan or Temerario, you know, or a modern 296, 812. But back then they were just sports cars. The supercars were the super rare, super hard to find that you'd almost never see, like a US F50 that I think there's like 42 examples of. These weren't the kind of things that you went to a shopping mall and saw in the valet. And so the supercars of Ferrari were the 288, F40, F50 Enzo. And then, of course, with the LaFerrari, we started to hear this word hypercar. And now we've even got mega cars. And again, there's not like a super firm definition of what is what, and it's not that important necessarily for us to even think about what is or isn't. What is fun to think about is how are these influencing society and automotive culture at large, and then, you know, how does that inform us of the ways to evangelize this hobby that we all love as car enthusiasts. And so, you know, now we'd say that a hypercar is probably 1,000 horsepower or more, $1 million or more, and a mega car, they say, I guess, is more than 1 horsepower per kilogram, like a Valkyrie or we'd say a Koenigsegg 1-to-1. And so there's a lot of debate as to like, what is the first supercar. Plenty of people, probably Ron Green included when he comes up, would say that a Mercedes 300 SL was the first supercar. Some would say the Miura, some would say the Countach, some would say the F40. And it doesn't really matter because generally we're putting a word on a historical car that it wasn't called in its time. And so, you know, I think as we start to look at exactly how cars are defined as supercars and what being a supercar means, it allows us to have a more informed conversation about where car culture is headed and why, at least in this moment, they're so important. And a big part of that is that so many people that grew up watching Top Gear, reading DuPont Registry, playing Gran Turismo, watching Gone in 60 Seconds and MTV Cribs, we were so heavily influenced, especially myself, by this car, to want and dream for these cars. They're the trophies of, you know, career achievement. They are, you know, the posters that were on our walls that hopefully somehow wind up in our garages. And you know, my career has been really defined by supercars and even more significantly by how humans engage with the idea of a supercar. I didn't grow up in a car-loving family. My dad and I weren't out in the driveway wrenching on something, and it was really something that I was taught by friends whose families were more into cars and really by watching television, reading magazines, and not paying attention in class, thumbing through Road and Tracker, Car and Driver. And so the idea of fast cars, of Cannonball, of all these things really just became heavily, heavily ingrained in my psyche and in the goals that I was setting for myself. And so my thought as I was exiting high school and entering college was like, how do I get to buy one of these cars? What does it take? How do you finance them? How hard are they to maintain? Can you actually use them and drive them? Like, what is it really like to live with? Because, even 20 years ago, these weren't something that you saw on every corner. And, look, that's not the case today, but there are so many more cars produced now that are more than $100,000 or have this kind of performance than even existed 20 years ago. We did a study with VinWiki about looking at the history of million-dollar cars on Earth. And we looked at 2003, which was kind of meaningful because it was right before the Enzo, the Carrera GT, and the SLR came out, and a bit before the Veyron. And at that point in 2003, there were about 1,400 million-dollar cars on Earth. And the first time we sort of dug into this, it was in 2018. And we found that there were probably about 25,000 cars in just that 15-year gap. Then we did it again in 2023, and there were 30,000. And so just in those 5 years, more than one car per day had become worth $1 million. And so when you think about that explosion in vehicle value at a time where we're really not seeing that kind of movement in iconic muscle cars, in pre-war cars, in really, really significant race cars and things like that were always sort of thought to be blue chips. It's not that they're necessarily going down, but they certainly haven't maintained the trajectory that they had in the 90s or early 2000s. And so in my quest to just figure out how can I have access to these cars, I landed on, in 2006, I was a student at Georgia Tech. And in 2006, this was at a time that preceded and very much precipitated the economic downturn of 2008 and 2009. And one of the reasons for that was that you could just call a bank and tell them how much money you thought, and they would say, you know what, you sound like you could afford a Lamborghini. And I did that as a 20-year-old person, and I bought a Lamborghini Gallardo, and I started renting it out. I started a company called Supercar Rentals, which was awesome, because not only did I get to play with this car, but also I got to introduce people to their dream of being around an exotic car pretty much every day. And it was awesome until it wasn't, and they all started crashing and stealing my cars and stuff like that. But overall, I kind of had thought that this was a business that works well in Miami, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, New York. Coming to a city like Atlanta, this seems like something that could work. And it was a really fun business, and especially as the economy started to decline, the notion of like ownership replacement through rental was a really, really compelling option. People were able to drive, own, and enjoy these cars without all of the sunk costs of insurance and maintenance and storage and things like that. And so they got to experience more cars, and I got to add more cars to the fleet, and it was great. But one of the things that was really, really great was that I was able, through all these crazy loans, to get bulletproof car credit. And that has served me very, very well since then. And, to me, in learning, like, wait a minute, you mean to tell me that most of the people that have these cars in their garages don't have the titles in some drawer in the office and they have gigantic liens on them? Yes, they do. And so in 2009, I started to be courted by the local exotic car dealerships here in Atlanta, Ferrari of Atlanta and Lamborghini Atlanta, because the issue that they were running into is that the fertile economy, not unlike the last few years, but of 2005 to 2008, was starting to change. People were experiencing a lot more depreciation. It was costing a lot more to own these cars, and they were having a lot harder time selling them. And I thought, that sounds like a fun challenge for a little while. And I always thought, maybe letting strangers drive my cars every day might not be the ultimate way to sleep well at night. And I had certainly experienced some challenges there, but I said, let's go see if maybe owning a dealership is the right way. And I kind of realized through the rental car company that I would have been very well served to have spent a summer working at Enterprise or Hertz to learn how they do this business, rather than just like, I'll figure it out. And so I was like, let's go work at a dealership, see how it goes. And so I was the director of sales at Lamborghini Atlanta from 2009 to 2015, and I loved it. I miss the day-to-day negotiations and car dealerships. It was a whole lot of fun, but I did not miss the 80-hour weeks. But I also learned very quickly that I did not want to be on the hook for all of this inventory that could move in either direction value-wise. And so I had a whole lot of fun there. And really a big part of the focus was like, all right, well, how do people most efficiently and easily own these cars? How do they finance them? How do they trade in and out? What kind of liquidity are they looking for? What do they prioritize as they're searching? And what inspired them? Why did they walk in the door to contemplate owning one of the cars? And one of the reasons why I went to work at Lamborghini Atlanta rather than Ferrari of Atlanta was that even in 2009, it wasn't like you could just walk in and buy a 16M. They were still hard to get, and I wanted the challenge. So when I started at Lamborghini Atlanta, they'd sold 5 new cars that year, and by the time I left, we were doing, I don't know, 80 to 100. We'd added more brands and stuff like that. And so learned a lot, loved that, and really just knew that ultimately I wanted to end up somewhere else doing something entrepreneurial. And while I was there, I had also pursued that other part of falling in love with cars, Cannonball. And if you saw, one of the displays that's going to be coming up here at Savoy is Cannonball Run cars. And one of them will be my 2004 Mercedes CL55 AMG. Because that idea of trying to figure out just how fast we could drive across the country is one that doesn't just leave your mind. It sits in the back and just says, hey, why don't you go make some bad decisions? And so in 2013, with a couple of friends, I went out and I set the record for driving from New York to Los Angeles. We did it in 28 hours, 50 minutes. And so that CL55 generally lives at another Georgia car museum, miles through time, up in Clarksville. And so that was really, really fun in that it was kind of an entrepreneurial endeavor. You can't make any money from it. Very much the opposite, but it was solving a lot of problems at the same time and hopefully achieving something that somebody cares about. And fortunately, it was very, very helpful in generating new leads to sell cars at the dealership. And so I wrote a book about that kind of as I left the dealership. We had a young child at home, and I was just trying to figure out where does my career go from here and how does it have cars in it? And I, in trying to compose a 300-page story about 3 sweaty guys going really fast across the country and not getting into trouble, I realized we probably need a little more to that. And so I started to mix in the stories that I'd had from selling cars at the dealership and the old days of renting cars and stuff like that. And so I put together a book. It's called For the Record, and it talks about my pursuit, the idea of Cannonball and the idea of cars and the businesses and things like that all coming together. And so I had all these stories, and I had also done a few different things while I was at the dealership about just the ways that we understand the cars that we love. And so my favorite car on earth is a Lamborghini Murcielago LP640 with a manual transmission. And that's what's out there, my Roadster. I have the coupe version as well. I've had it for a bit longer. But when I was selling these cars, I would occasionally get requests. And as you see, this car, many of the other cars that have come out since then, almost all of them have sequential manual paddle shift transmissions. And while there's a lot of merit there, and it was a very necessary part of automotive engineering, especially in the 2000s, where we started to have more restrictions on car emissions and how dirty cars were allowed to be and stuff like that, the best way to make them go faster was to improve the gearboxes. And so if you could make the car shift faster, they could go from 0 to 60 faster, quarter mile faster, all this stuff. And so we had the era of the single clutch sequential manual transmission that gave way to the DSG or double clutch gearboxes as well. But I loved the manual cars. And the prevailing logic was that when it was an option, say on a Ferrari 360, 430, Lamborghini Murcielago, Gallardo, when you could have either one, whereas now you don't have a choice on most cars, when it was an option, they thought it was a 90% take rate. They thought 90% of the people wanted the paddle shift cars. In most cases, despite the fact that the manufacturers didn't have records to this, it was actually more like 99%. And so I asked Lamborghini corporate, I'm like, well, how many of my favorite car in my favorite configuration did you make? And they're like, we don't even know what that means. We don't have records. We don't keep like a file of all this stuff. And I'm like, well, I have this system. Can you just go in here and type in ZHWBU37M as a prefix to the VIN and tell me how many things come out? They're like, no, we don't even know how to do that. I don't have a login for that. And so I had to manually start building a list of these cars. And whereas people would have thought there were about 200 to 300 of them, I found out that there were only 23 coupes and 10 roadsters that came to the US. And there were only 88 worldwide coupes and 16 worldwide roadsters. And so that black car that's on the display is one of 10 US cars and one of 16 worldwide. And there was a moment where I was the only person on earth that knew that. And I had the best car credit you've ever seen in your life. And so I found the nicest one that existed. It was a fluorescent green car that now lives in a billionaire's collection in Seattle. And I got a loan for 100% of it for 12 years. And I set out driving, and I was loving my life. It was the perfect thing. Honestly, though, having owned just about every color of them by now, the fluorescent green is a problem. Like, I mean, 3 meaningful accidents adjacent me taking pictures of this car. So I wasn't that upset to go to something a little more subdued. But as I started to then tell the world how rare these cars were, and R.M. Sotheby's was referencing Ed Bolian's articles, they're trying to sell other cars, it of course caused them to go up in value. And I have had a great deal of success in my financial life by buying cars overly aggressively with leverage that I dreamt about younger, and my more rational people in my age cohort catch up with me, and the cars go up in value later. And so that has been a huge part of me being able to continue to flip through these things and continue to drive them a lot and get them as dirty as this thing. But sorry for that. I didn't realize the lights would be so good. But so as they went up in value, that was kind of at a point where I was transitioning away from the dealership, just looking for what was going to be next. And it was that kind of idea that we can attach ourselves so much to the cars that we love just by becoming a part of the story. And so building that list of those cars, driving a CL55 across the country faster than anybody else ever had, it was a way that we could change the way the cars were perceived, change the way that we were perceived, and really become a part of this hobby that we love. And that led to some discussions with some friends and a business that we now call VinWiki. So in 2016, some friends and I launched an app called VinWiki that is what we call a crowdsourced vehicle history reporting platform, meaning it's like a social version of Carfax. So the idea being that anybody can post information to any car by its VIN or by its license plate. And so now we've got more than 500,000 users in that app, and so people will go around to these cars that are on display, they'll take their own picture, they'll interpret it in their own way, they'll post it to the timeline of this car that, in the case of mine, will go alongside all 3 accidents that it's had and the spray paint that went over some of the damage at some point and all the terrible history, and the rest of them are nice. But it attaches some really, really interesting data points, like the fact that Ron Green's XJ220 is the one that Jeremy Clarkson demonstrated turbo lag about on Top Gear. And these things that were so impressionable on our lives and our love of the automobile can now be a little bit more easily accessed. And so we launched that as some, budding technology entrepreneurs out of my garage. And we think that we're going to tap that domino. A butterfly's going to flap its wings in Kansas. Everybody's going to download it, tell their friends. We're going to be the next Ed Zuckerbergs. And it doesn't happen that way at all. And in fact, every time, we thought, oh, Twitter just took off or Instagram took off. Well, it turned out that they spent millions and millions of dollars that I didn't have advertising it before that happened. And so about a year later, I thought, well, why don't we take some of these cars, take some of these stories, and start to put them out there on the internet? And so I got a bunch of pizza and beer, called a bunch of guys to come over to my warehouse, and we just sat down and started recording car stories. And so VinWiki Car Stories as a YouTube channel started about a year after VinWiki the app, and that is where all of the growth came from. And then suddenly my day job became interviewing people and making car stories for the internet, which at the time was not like a well-paying job, but it was like, we're getting new users, this makes sense. And now we've got about 2.1 million subscribers. We've had about 2 billion views. Again, it's gained about 500,000 users in our app, which still doesn't really make money, but one day maybe, I guess. And but it's allowed us to just capture and immortalize so many amazing car stories, like Seth chasing down his grandfather's Countach and so many other things that are just the perfect examples of how we connect with these cars and, just what makes us love them. Now, my approach personally has always been that, if I can buy these cars in the worst possible form and make them nicer, then usually I get to kind of own them for free. Because as in seeing the people that were, kind of beating the game from a dealership perspective, they weren't always chasing this newest, latest, greatest, biggest, baddest, coolest thing. It was very much like, no, I like this, I know this, I can buy this, make it this, and then sell it for that. And I said, well, that seems like a cool thing. And so as I was trying to get this app to take off, my very large, heavily leveraged payment on that first Lamborghini Murcielago was becoming a real problem. but I found the worst one on earth. And I was like, this seems like a cartwheel that could happen where I have made this car go up in value. There's a profit here. And it's worth about the same as the one that has the terrible history. And this was a car that was also a manual transmission Lamborghini LP640, but it had been fraudulently reported stolen after a 15-year-old crashed it because he was too drunk to drive, and the father of the girl that he'd just gotten pregnant was too drunk to drive, and they had spun it out in the middle of a Toronto highway and taken the dealer plate off and run off into the forest and then reported it stolen the next morning. And he was really, the father-in-law was only there because being a car dealer was the best way for him to smuggle drugs into the United States. And so the kid's job was to cut the frame rails and stuff drugs in, and they would sell them through the auctions. They would come into the U.S., a great 15-year-old job, I suppose. And honestly, he didn't want to be a drug dealer. He was a terrorist. He got kicked out of Iran for blowing up bazaars, this guy. A lot of news stories attached to this car. But this, formerly crashed, formerly kind of stolen, they ended up fixing the car in Lebanon after the insurance didn't fix it. But I was able to buy that car for the profit of the first one, which if I drove it to Caffeine and Octane, which I did many times, nobody knew that it was so crashed and terrible. And so I was like, this is amazing. And in car guy math, if I bought it with the profit from the last one, that makes it free. Exactly. So that was the free Lamborghini. And I drove it for a little while, fixed it up a bit, sold it, and I bought the current one. And so, that has always been my mentality. And as people who grew up loving these cars have entered the market from a participatory perspective, it has caused some pretty unexpected jumps in value. And whether or not we should think of these cars as an asset class or as an investment is a conversation for many other days of my life. But in reality, what we have seen is that there's a lot of cars like Lamborghini Diablos and Ferrari F40s that have 5x'd in value. There's a lot of cars like F50s and LP640s that have 10x'd in value in the last decade. And we've even got some examples like AMG Hammers that have 100x'd in value over less than a 10-year period. And it's pretty phenomenal to see market forces like that at play. And what it illustrates is not the soundness of these cars as an investment. What it illustrates is the power of our emotions to drive where we spend our money and what we chase as goals, as trophies, and hopefully as things to put the right pedal down and drive a really long way, maybe a little bit faster than we're supposed to. And so, the love of the supercar and my obsession with it, like I said, has driven a lot about my career and about my journey. And it's so cool to me that we've got museums and institutions of the American automotive hobby truly recognizing how special these are and how it is the best way to get so many people in the door and on to, whatever their automotive goals become. Now, I will say, as we were having the early days of having to really grind through VinWiki as a business, I already had my dream car. And for any car enthusiast, that is the worst thing that could possibly happen to you from a motivational perspective. And so I had to say, I need another dream car. And it needed to make no sense at all. And I'd like to show you my Bugatti Veyron, because there was a day where I did not have remotely even the credit to go out and afford such a vehicle, but I said, I need a new dream. And I said, I'm going to buy a Bugatti, which is a thing that you say as you embark on a rap career. Not my life at that point, but through many, many acts of shrewd negotiation and insultingly low offers, I eventually was able to purchase this just a few months ago. It is a 2012 Bugatti Veyron Grand Sport, very much a supercar, certainly as well now a hypercar. It was the Frankfurt Motor Show car on display by Bugatti in 2011. And then it was bought by one of the partners at Symbolic Motor Company, who was later arrested for trying to fix a mayoral election. Then it was sold to Birdman of Cash Money Records, not the Miami Heat. He gave it to Justin Bieber as a present. And there's a lot of pictures of Justin and Soulja Boy driving around in it. And they had it for a while. It may or may not have been repossessed, but there's evidence to support that it was. And then it was sold to Floyd Money Mayweather to preemptively celebrate beating Conor McGregor in their little boxing match. And after that, it was sold to someone whose name is Lil Uzi Vert, who I don't know exactly why he's famous. I'm not sure anybody does. But he had it for a while. He turned my speed key into a bedazzled necklace and retained it. And then it was sold to somebody who might make money through airplanes, might also make money in the way that the father of the crasher of my Lamborghini did. And then I bought it. And so it's been around the world, not in the greatest of ways, but I love it. And it is the perfect terrible history example of one of my favorite cars, which is my MO. And I could not be enjoying it anymore. We took it out in the rainy morning to Caffeine and Octane. We were going to take the cars out of the shop. It was supposed to be raining even more, and so we did not do that. But I try to drive them as much as I can. When you buy a terrible one, you know, the typical logic of like if you put too many miles on it, it's going to devalue it. Doesn't matter, because if I drive it a long way, it proves that it's not still broken. And so it's like a foolproof plan, except it is usually still broken. And so we've had to do a lot of reconditioning to various things. But through some backdoor negotiations, I did finally get in touch with Mr. Vert, and he provided me with a key that doesn't work. And I don't know if I've been scammed by him yet, but the jury's still out there. But I am loving the car, and it sits right next to the LP640. I think if all of them were to go, though, the black one that's here is my favorite. And so I'd like to call a couple of the other owners of the cars that are here down, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Did Ron make it in?
Yep.
Beautiful. Ron Green. This is Seth Cathy, grandson of Truett Cathy. Great to see you, sir.
Yeah.
And Ron Green, by my approximation, one of the greatest car collectors of the Atlanta area, and a wonderful friend of about 20 years now. That's it. And so there's a mic for you. So we're going to talk a little bit about these cars. And Seth, you just had your story of finally acquiring the Countach on the channel. I'd love for you to tell me, talk about the early days of falling in love with cars through seeing that car in your granddad's shop.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much for your time here and your voice in the automotive industry. Thank you for Bruce for making us all come together to show. Glad to be a part of it. My name is Seth Cathy. My grandfather, Truett Cathy, was the founder of Chick-fil-A. His first restaurant was in Atlanta, Georgia, right across the street from the Ford Motor Plant. One of the few cars, he collected over 300 cars in the last 18 years of his life. At age 75 in 1996, started collecting cars. One of those cars that he bought was the 1983 Lamborghini Countach. He bought that car in 1999 for $50,000. So he got it, bundled it with 11 other cars, bought a dozen cars from the Root family collection. The Root family's famous glass makers and Coca-Cola blotters that designed the original Coca glass bottle. And at age 8 years old, my grandfather grew up in the Great Depression, born in 1921, actually lived near where Georgia Tech's campus is now, was the first federally funded housing project in the nation, which my grandfather moved into when he was a young boy. And at age 8 years old, his first entrepreneurial endeavor was selling those Coca-Cola glass bottles door to door. So he said his most proud investment, yes, he had 300 cars by the time he passed away 10 years ago, now at age 93, but his most proud purchase of his life was a $4 bicycle that he saved up money that he helped him with his paper route. But like I mentioned, that car that I have is the 83 Countach. Out of those 300 cars, those are probably the two most memorable, in my opinion, and maybe the general public's opinions, is the Batmobile, which is still on display at the Chick-fil-A headquarters in the atrium. If you've ever had a chance to tour that, it's still on display there. And the Lamborghini Countach, also set on display many years at the Chick-fil-A headquarters. But I made a list a couple summers ago of about 8, 9 cars. I was just curious where they ended up. We had a closed auction. I mentioned my grandfather the past 10 years ago, back in 2014. 2 years after he passed, we had a big closed charity auction. And I'd say about 95, 98% of his cars were sold off in that charity auction. You had to be a Chick-fil-A owner, operator, or staff person to be part of that auction. Nobody put the minimum bid, and it was the highest appraised car part of that sale at that time, which is $300,000. Nobody put the minimum bid on it, and it sold about 2 or 3 months later to a group of 3 guys as an investment. They bought it for $275,000 back in 2016. I started finding this out, and I knew those 3 guys bought it, and I was like, where did this car go? I was just curious. At the time, I was just curious to know where it went, because I didn't have enough money to buy the thing back. The values, like you mentioned, of these cars have climbed exponentially, even for the Countach, a lot in the past 10 years. Ended up tracking it down, reached out to John Tamarian of Curated down in Miami, and he found the car in Italy. My heart sank when I found it had crossed the ocean, gone back to its country of origin. Come to find out, it had been, after those three gentlemen sold it in 2016, went to London. They had it repainted in London. They removed the US spec bumpers off of it, returned to the original European spec, and was bought by a buyer out of southern Italy, and it was there for 4 years before John Tamarian bought it, kind of on my behalf, essentially. And he was very generous enough, and I thanked him on your YouTube video, and every time I have the opportunity, a big shout out to John Tamarian Curated. They talked about paying it forward, and he for sure did that for me. He kept it off the showroom floor for the better part of a year while I got my finances in order to purchase my grandfather's car back. So I've had it now for, I think this coming summer will be maybe 2 years since I've owned it, and it's a joy to drive. I tell people you gotta be in the right mood to drive it. You gotta take your shoes off. I got to drive my friend John's Countach this morning, and I had to take my shoes off to drive the thing because of how tight the foot pedals is. But it's an amazing car, and like you're saying, talking about the VinWiki stories, to me the most important thing is the story. Talking about a kid who grew up, he always said that the only toy he had to play with growing up was a loose tooth, and that was his brother's loose tooth. And he joked about it, but surely he grew up and he really knew, really experienced the throes of poverty, and that inspired him to become the strong entrepreneur and businessman that he became, and always had a heart for others. So I love the story of the car. Yes, it's a cool car. Yes, it gets a lot of attention, just like John's car did this morning at Caffeine Octane. But really, for me, it's the story about this kid who grew up in the Great Depression, who, by the time he passed away, age 93, started collecting cars age 75, acquired 300 cars that he'd love to share with others. So glad to be able to share it here at Savoy, and glad to be a part of this event today. Thank you, Ed.
Absolutely. What a story. This is Ron Green. He is the owner of the Jaguar XJ220. How long have you had that car?
I bought the car in 2002.
Okay. Wow, that is so. And what is the car that you've owned the longest now?
I've had a Mercedes 300 SL for about 40 years, I guess.
How many 300 SLs have you had in the last 40 years?
Well, I have 2 of them now.
There we go. That's what you got to do, accumulate. Now, how many cars do you have now?
Well, I can say I've always, when people ask me why I have 70 cars, I've always pointed to Truett to show how sane that I actually was.
That's amazing. And I mean, just an awesome collection. And what I love about your collection is that it's not all one thing. There are pre-war cars, there are race cars, there are muscle cars, and there's modern supercars. Do you feel like you've got a favorite?
Speed Vision called that eclectic. I called it a guy that couldn't make up his damn mind what he liked. So.
That's fair. So, you know, of a lot of the cars that would be considered the first supercar, the Miura, you got one of those.
A Miura.
The 300 SL, you got a couple of those. Countach, you got one of those.
Countach.
And so, what do you think was the first supercar?
That's a good question. The supercars really, as you alluded to earlier, supercars really started much earlier than the nomenclature
Right.
came with it. I had a RS lightweight Porsche that would have been considered a supercar if the term existed at the time.
Sure.
Aston DB4 GT, same thing.
Yes.
2 cars I wish that I still had very much.
And you've had so many amazing cars, and we bought and sold cars together, and it was just, you know, so many cars that you loved were so far ahead of their time. And, you know, you had a collection of the Lamborghini vertical before that was even thought of in a mainstream collector sense. And I feel like that's one of the things that makes it so authentic. And I think that you've bought cars that you love and that, you know, have obviously become considerably more appreciated over time. But that wasn't it. It's just how much you love owning and driving them. So which one do you like to drive the most?
There's a Ferrari 275. It's a really, really sweet driving car.
A connoisseur in the gone in 60 seconds sense of the word. Well, thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Ed. Thank you very much.
Yes.
And Ed,
So,
if I
Yeah.
went real fast, you did a video recently in which you took your daily drive. Can you daily drive a Bugatti? It was his
That's
video he
right.
posted recently. He gave a free Chick-fil-A sandwich at the Chick-fil-A drive-thru. So
I appreciate. I got to replenish the stash.
Yes.
That's it. Nothing tastes better than a free chicken sandwich in a Bugatti seat, I can promise you that. Yeah, I mean, all of the cars that are here, and certainly these supercars, represent some incredible stories, some incredible owners, not even just the current owners, but everybody who has been a caretaker of the cars in the past. And so I'd love to answer some questions, so if anybody's got anything they'd like to ask, we'll open up the floor for that.
Okay, we'll have microphones here, so if you could just wait, we'll get you the microphone.
So you've told us basically what your favorite car is, but of all the cars that you haven't driven, what is there one that you just are dying to get your hands on just to drive?
So for me, the ultimate car is a McLaren F1. And fortunately, I got to drive one for a production that we did a few years ago called Car Trek. And so the spiritual successor of that car isn't a P1 or a Senna or anything. It is now the GMA T50S. And so that car being built by Gordon Murray Automotive, to me, is the most exciting thing in a modern context. And it's, you know, I don't ask people to drive a lot of cars, but when I find somebody who has one, I am on the plane.
Got one on the front row.
Yeah.
So you already said that for the car guy, the worst thing is to own your favorite car. I mean, you might have just answered the question, but now that you have what you'd consider your newest favorite car, what would be the next one on your list?
My next favorite one would be, yeah, having one of these with the title would be a very different experience than my current existence. But it occurred to me that on a percentage basis, financially, I'm about as far away from a McLaren F1 as I was from that when I said it. And so as irresponsible, I'm not going to say it out loud, but maybe. I mean, I don't think I want to be rich enough to have a $20 million car. I have to ask Ron how that is. Yes, sir.
So this is actually for Seth. Here you have like 3,000 cars. Ron's got 500,000 also. Seth, I've only heard about one from you, though. Has it bitten you where you're going to get more cars? Are you going to track down some more of these other cars?
Yeah, absolutely. I made a deal with my wife, and car guys know how that goes. I made a deal with my wife that I wouldn't buy any more collector cars unless my grandfather had owned them. The downside of that, of course, I have got 300 options to choose from that are out there. And we have some records where they were initially sold in 2016. But I have 3 of them now. So kind of my goal is to have one per decade of the life in which my granddad lived through. So I have a Ford Model T, 1923. He has a special connection with Ford, with his first restaurant being right across the street from the Ford motor plant. But I do desire to own more cars. And really, I'm not a really big car guy. Like, I'm not a mechanic. I wasn't raised with a dad who was always wrenching on something in the garage or anything. But my love for cars came from my granddad's collection. So anything out of his collection I would love to have. But there's definitely a few personal favorites I have of that. But my overall goal to have one per decade of the life and times in which he lived his life through.
I mean, how good would he look in that Batmobile? I mean, that's it. That's
Okay,
it.
Ed, I have one over here.
Yes. Thanks.
So my father's driven a lot of cars that he said it was his dream car, but ended up he did not like it. Has there been a car that you drove that you ended up you realized you didn't really like?
The meet your heroes problem is always a thing. So what car have I driven that didn't live up to the hype? And you know, it's one of those things that a lot of these cars, they're worth what they're worth because of what they are more than how they are to use. And so, you know, the McLaren F1 for me, fortunately, did live up to the hype. It's still, I'd say I'd rather put miles on a Mercy, but it's crazy enough that you still have to want it. The one that I ran into that I really had a hard time loving, despite it making more sense on paper than anything else, actually there's 2 of those. One is a Koenigsegg CCX. You know, they had 12 U.S. legal cars, proper manual gearbox, the coolest doors anybody ever put on anything. No, that's not a spaceship. And I loved what it could have been. Driving it in anything other than the biggest road you've ever seen with nobody around is really, really tough, especially at 6.5 feet tall. And so that is the caveat for me, is like, I'd love to have that Viper ACR Extreme out there, but I would need 3 less inches of myself in order to enjoy it properly. The other car was a Roof RT12S. I bought one of those. Now, admittedly, I bought my kind of that car, so it had been involved in a lawsuit in Miami for 3 years, and it sat outside in the rain, and it was in pretty rough shape, and it wasn't running all that well, and I couldn't afford to make it nice. And so that wasn't fair to it, but it wasn't very good. And I have not missed that one since it went along.
Got one up here, Ed.
Is there any update on the F1 that was in Mexico?
Is there any update on the F1 that is in Mexico? He is speaking about McLaren F1 Chassis 039. It is a Brazilian brown metallic over red with gold wheels, as quintessentially good looking as you could ever spec one, I believe, that was owned by El Chapo's most prolific drug runner. And he was unfortunately killed in 1997 in a shootout in the street where someone shot his vehicle 300 times. And one of the bullets went in through the lock cylinder and hit his abdomen. And he was able to drive the vehicle back to his house because his son was in the floorboard. But he did not mention to his son or anyone else where he had put the key to his McLaren F1 when he was killed. And so whoever owned it at the time inquired to the factory as to if they would replace the key. And at the time, they quoted him $250,000 for a key, which is a lot. And they were not going to pay that because at the time, to be quite honest, this would have been probably $99,000, $2,000. That's about how much bad history F1 would have been worth back then, even though today it's probably $20 million. And so I got a couple leads on that car a few years ago and chased them enough to hear that maybe the cartel had talked about how to lure me into Mexico with some money and kill me over it, but they didn't do it. And so I have not found out. I think it is in a living room in Sinaloa, still owned by the son, but that's the best lead I have and no pictures. It comes about every 6 months somebody has a really good idea, but I am no closer to that one, unfortunately. And I'm not sure if you're even allowed to buy it from them. I mean, we could have to clear it with the State Department or something.
Okay, we have another question up here, Ed.
Yeah.
Hey, in terms of longevity for the Bugatti, have you considered just purchasing 4 used wheels, or have you had any luck getting the tire off the spare rim that you had bought?
So there have always been various cars where the concern of ongoing maintenance is a problem. And this is probably the hero of all of those in all the bad ways. Tires for an XJ220 were always notoriously hard to get and very expensive to replace. And Bugatti was like, well, we can make that worse. And so they put what are called Michelin Pax tires on this car, which in order for the car at its weight to go 253 miles an hour, 407 kilometers an hour, they needed the strongest tires that had ever been made. And Michelin had this run-flat design called Pax, P-A-X, and they are essentially a triple beaded tire where the inner diameter of the wheel is smaller than the outer diameter of the wheel. You have to reverse mount them upright, and there is a disc, a plastic disc that runs around the barrel of the wheel to essentially support a deflated tire, and that has to be glued on. The tires are effectively glued to it, and they're impossible to remove. And so they were used on a few other cars, Maybachs and Rolls-Royces in Europe for 1 or 2 years, as well as 2005 to 2009 Honda Odyssey minivans. And with those minivans, the Honda dealers just throw the used wheels away with the tires because it's too much trouble. They cut a hole in them to get the tire monitor out, and that's what happens. So there are only 2 machines in the world that are strong enough to remove the tires on these cars. And originally, they were $5,000 each, and then they had a price increase for no good reason, and they were $7,500. Now they're $10,000 each, so it's $40,000 for a set of these tires, and every third set, you have to replace your wheels, which are $120,000. Now, as you probably have gleaned, I hope you have gleaned from my presentation here, I am in no position whatsoever to spend $160,000, but they have heard my cries. And right now, Bugatti is working on having Michelin make a normal tire that will somehow stick to these wheels, and they're going to tell us not to go 250 miles an hour on them, which I will gladly abide by as long as they're more like normal tire prices. And so, there are a lot of owners that put aftermarket wheels on them, but they are not mathematically the right size. HRE maintains that they have done studies, and I don't feel like risking an $80,000 differential to have to save $40,000 on tires, plus whatever they cost me for that. So right now, they are old and bald, and as long as it doesn't rain too much, I drive it. And I generally, when I have these cars, it's not as though I just paid retail price and got it off the showroom floor and I can experience everything that it does. It takes time. And so I am waiting patiently, not that patiently. I call them a lot. And they're supposed to make me some tires soon.
Got another one up here, Ed, at the top.
Having owned supercars and all of the amazing experiences that you've been able to have behind the wheel of a vehicle, what is probably the most pedestrian car that has surprised you the most?
So of all the experiences and all the dreams and all the things I've gotten to do, what is the most pedestrian car that I've enjoyed the most? I learned that because Brock Yates, who was the founder of Cannonball Run and was the editor of Car and Driver, he was very good friends with Brumos Audi and the team over there. And so he had partnered with them to make an Audi 4000S Quattro Cannonball edition that he autographed the back of. And obviously Brock Yates became very much a hero of mine. And I actually interviewed him for a high school project as a senior talking about automotive journalism. And I told him that one day I wanted to go out and break all the records. And he had kind of written in his book that there were twice as many people on the road and twice as many cops, and the penalties for getting caught speeding were so much higher that nobody would be dumb enough to try. And he should have been right, but he was very, very cordial. And he passed away in 2016. I had the distinct honor of writing his obituary for several publications, but I found one of those cars that had been owned by an architect that went to college with my mother and had moved to Seattle, and I chased it for years, and he finally passed away, and I was able to connect with the widow, and I bought that car, and it was it was so bad as a vehicle, but it was cool. And so, you know, I think it's easy to find charm in cars that are not supercars, that don't have these superlatives about them, and that give you a heat stroke when you drive them through Death Valley. And I was able to get that car and cannonball it with some friends, and it's certainly the most fun I've had in a proper terrible car. I don't know if that's true either.
Okay, Ed, I have one up here in the center.
Great.
Is there a vehicle that you've owned that you wish you hadn't sold?
Are there any that I wish I hadn't sold? Well, the fact that first LP640 is probably worth $2 million makes me think a little bit about it. But I at the same time, I think I've had enough fun to enjoy them. There's one of them. I owned the most famous McLaren in the world. And it is not an F1, but it was not made famous for automotive reasons. It was ingrained in our mind, not that dissimilarly to the Countach in Cannonball Run, but on one fateful night, Paris Hilton, Britney Spears, and Lindsay Lohan were all in that car, and not all of them were wearing underpants. And as they exited the car, Britney Spears exposed herself to the paparazzi, and it was photographed more than I think any car has ever been shared around the internet. And I don't care what we can do as car enthusiasts, we are never going to match the publicity value of the unsheathed undercarriage of Britney Spears. And I got that car through a Mannheim auction in Dallas, owned it for a good long while, drove it a lot, really enjoyed it. SLR maintenance is about as scary as this thing, but I sold it to a man for a lot of cryptocurrency from Bulgaria, as you do. And I just, I do miss that one. My wife loved it, but that's probably the only one that really got away. Yes, sir. Oh.
So Ed, you've seen many generations of supercars as you've worked in the dealership and as you've done VinWiki and you've had several cars. What would you say are the things that modern supercar creators are not doing well, and what do you wish that they would do that they're not doing?
So as we see the evolution of the supercar and the hypercar, what do I think people are doing well and what are they not? It's easy for me, loving very analog, very manual, not many buttons cars, just say, oh, these newfangled hybrid electric, whatever, aren't for me. But, I believe in that my age cohort is probably not the market for those. We do know, no offense to your 918, that these hybrid hypercars of the 20-teens are proving to be somewhat problematic from time to time, and that threatens the longevity of value. And it's important that museums aren't the only places that these cars exist 50 years from now. And with a lot of these overly technological cars, that is a liability. I believe that the most fertile business opportunity in the automotive landscape right now is someone who can build a box that makes a car that expects its hybrid battery to be charged, to believe that it's charged, and simply not use it when it doesn't exist anymore. And someone will solve that, and they will transform the appreciation of the LaFerrari P1 918 market. 918 is the hardest because of the way that the hybrid system is located. But the same for SF90s. These cars are proving wildly difficult to keep on the road, especially given the service capacities of most Ferrari, Lamborghini and dealers and McLaren dealers as well. And so I worry about electrification purely for a long-term value perspective. The benefits from a performance perspective are clear. The cars are insanely fast and they're very, very capable. But I know that the only way that I can experience and really enjoy these cars from an ownership perspective is to abide by my greatest allergy, which is automotive depreciation. And unreliability is what causes these things to happen. And so that needs to happen to some extent, and then we have to figure out how to independently service this car that doesn't even have a hood latch. And so that's what scares me. I mean, we know that Rimac has said they can't sell cars. Pininfarina has not sold cars very well. And so I think the pure electric cars are scary, but the hybrid cars are also pretty scary.
Okay, there's another question up here in the center, all the way up here.
Gotcha.
I'm a very aggressive supercar collector. It just happens to be Hot Wheels. But even those are hard to come by because there's treasure hunts, and I find that treasure hunts in the Hot Wheel collections tend to lean heavy on the supercars. And so you mentioned at the beginning of your talk the promotion of the supercars. They might be the answer for the next generation. The companies that produce these cars, how aggressively do they negotiate with Hot Wheels, movie makers? Hot Wheels even put out a video game that I have where I'm racing basically Hot Wheels that are supercars. So do you have any inclinations on the furthering of supercars to this next generation, like through toys and those kind of things?
Yeah, so the question is, how, as automotive manufacturers interact with toy manufacturers like Mattel and Hot Wheels, as well as movies for cameos and features and things like that, how does that influence the cars, and what are they doing to be so proactive? I mean, when you think about, like we talked, the Countach and Cannonball Run has influenced more car lovers than I think any other moment in time. And I think, they say that the craziest hobby on earth starts 97 cents at a time, which I guess with inflation is now $1.49, which is crazy, right? But I also love Hot Wheels. My son and I have always built elaborate Hot Wheels tracks and things like that, and it's amazing. But when you look at certain examples of those things, like, Porsche wouldn't license to Gran Turismo. And Roof was like, our cars look like Porsches because we buy them from them and we just change the VINs and then we sell them, and they're like, we can have Porsches without paying them. And that's the only reason. Beyond the Yellowbird on the Nürburgring is very powerful, but really most people were first exposed to Roof via Gran Turismo. And most people love Diablo SVs because of Need for Speed. And most people like Ferrari 275s because Nicolas Cage told us that connoisseurs drive them. That wasn't even real. I mean, but it is now, and I know people that are spending 7 figures on cars because of a throwaway line in a remake movie. And, I mean, that movie also 10x the value of GT500s. And so you're right that what the manufacturers can do is really focus on the ways that they can integrate their products into so many of these movies and popular culture references. And the more that they can, the more successful they're going to be. But obviously movies have changed a lot in the post-COVID era. And so I don't know that they're doing a great job of it, but you are not wrong that it works well.
I think you just about answered my question a couple questions ago, but are there any electric supercars, the Rimac or Navara, that sort of thing?
There are some great electric supercars. I think the Pininfarina Battista, which is also the same thing as a Navara, it's just got a prettier body on it, is amazing. And we're still going to see so many hybridizations. The Bugatti Tourbillon is still a hybrid. Hopefully they'll make them long-term maintainable, and I think that is a real, consideration now. But there's nothing at all wrong with electrification, but most of us that have driven electric cars feel like there is something missing. And realistically, I love taking a car that is totally out of its own context to drive to lunch or a coffee shop or, on a trip to Florida, and then suffering through it and falling out of it at a gas station as somebody thinks, oh man, that's going to be really cool. And then they watch my crippled self, crawling to the pump like it's Wolf of Wall Street 2.0. And I'm like, no, it's awesome. It is as cool as you think. I'm using it wrong. And so, I call it automotive masochism, that I enjoy having to feel these cars that I dreamt of so much. And you don't necessarily get that out of something more modern. And everybody who prefers that is more right than I am. But I want to buy the stuff that I, know is going to make me hurt. And if I sometimes, through just buying and flipping other cars, I end up with a car that's too comfortable. And I have to sell it because I'll go out with a bag and I go on a road trip and I'm like, oh, I'll just take that thing. I can't have that junk. So I got to have just uncomfortable cars.
Got one right here.
Yep.
So first, my Hot Wheel friend back there, I went looking for a 1969 Red Baron Hot Wheel for my granddaughter. Sticker shock got me. I didn't get it for her, so a little too pricey. We started this by saying that don't know what a supercar is, but I'll know when I see it. So one definition maybe is just a car that tugs on your heartstrings. So Ron, for you, in your life, what car has caught your heart the most that you've owned?
One car I just recently got, I was at a museum in L.A. and saw a car that I had dreamed about for years and years, but had never seen one in person. That was a Bizzarini. Yes. If you're familiar with the Bizzarinis or not, but it's Corvette powered. It was created by the same Italian that worked for Ferrari at one point and did the GTO. He later went on to Lamborghini and developed the V12. And this particular Bizzarini was owned by Kerry Lofton, the stunt driver that did pretty much every car movie you've seen. He was the key stunt guy on. So the Bizzarini probably would be one of those cars that just grabbed me like that.
There we go.
Okay, we have one up here.
So I'm a massive fan of Ford. And what do you think currently of the newly released Ford GTD that it's the first American car to beat, I think, go under 7 minutes. I think it did 6 minutes 57. And what I like to see is more American cars finally starting to, kick under the feet of Porsche, BMW, Lamborghini, Ferrari. I watch a lot of endurance racing. The first year the Mustang ever went out at Le Mans, it got third place, beating its counterpart. Do you think American companies are starting to take seriously of Corsa racing and course racing instead of the good old straight line speed that all of us guys love to do either way?
Great question. So the idea of, are the American manufacturers really catching up to the European mindset of road racing rather than just straight line and roundy round stuff? And, Ford has done some incredible things, obviously throughout their history. And it's not that we have to forgive them for misusing the Mustang name at one point, but the fact that they're trying to make it up to us with the GTD, I think is wonderful. And I'm a little worried they're going to overproduce it because they're starting to allocate them a little bit more willy-nilly when they took away my GT allocation just because I made a video about buying a Lamborghini from a prostitute. But I think that the car looks great. It obviously performs great. It lives up to all the hype that we want a great pony car to be. And so you're right. They're doing it the right way. And they're doing it the right way by breaking their own rules. And, it's been so hard for certain manufacturers like Ford to step away from enough usability that it makes the car undesirable. A GTD is a proper useless car. And that's what we want. We want it to be terrible. And I think they're on the right track. Now, should they have made enough storage on a new GT that you can take more than a toothbrush, and that toothbrush has to withstand 200-degree temperatures in its storage bin? That would be nice. But so maybe a little more useful in some cases, but I think they're on the right track.
Hey, Ed. I've enjoyed VinWiki. Thank you for all of your content that you put out there. Of all of the hundreds of videos that you've posted, 2 questions. One, who has been your favorite interview? And number 2, who have you not yet interviewed that you would love to have on VinWiki?
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for watching. You know, I think we've released about 2,500 car stories since 2017, and there are so many that have, you know, gotten the legs that they deserve, and a lot that haven't. I think my favorite interview is Bill Warner, who was the founder of the Amelia Island Concours, and his best story is a Ford story. Not a Bill Ford, but an Edsel Ford. He found the Edsel Ford Speedster in a not really a collection, but not exactly a junkyard, and was able to, you know, put all the pieces together, get it restored the right way. And it was every car guy's dream from a barn find perspective. It was, you know, a car that only he really understood, and he was the right person to sort of curate its legacy onto the next chapter. And then as he told the world how cool it was, it skyrocketed in value and became a life-changing financial win when he finally did sell the car. And it, you know, his wife spent it most on the house, but it was a really good thing for the family. And so I love Bill, and he'll probably be here doing something like this with me when we do the Cannonball cars, because he still has his from 1975. But yeah, I mean, that was it. You know, we still shoot all of them in Alpharetta at the room above my garage. We've had the VinWiki set a few different places, but people always ask, like, you know, who would you travel to interview? A lot of people say, well, you travel to interview me, and the answer is your name Jeremy Clarkson? I said, no, but maybe one day. But, you know, for Clarkson or Leno or something like that, I think obviously we'd be amazing. Honestly, I think I'm going to focus a little bit more on trying to get comedians that are coming through town, because they have, you know, they're good storytellers. They know how long their bits are, and, you know, we move in that direction. But, you know, we gotta talk to Clarkson one day.
I really enjoy watching all of your VinWiki videos about Cannonball. Are you going to be doing any more Cannonball races soon?
Am I going to be doing any more Cannonball races soon? So my very indulgent wife very much wanted to have children, and we both realized, hey, maybe you deal with this goal before children. And so we got pregnant the month after I set the record. And it's been a great decade since then, and fortunately, I have continued to do it. Not long after I set the record, I learned that there are a different breed of crazy Cannonball enthusiasts that do cheap car races, not unlike the 24 Hours of Lemons and things like that. And so we've done an event called the 2904, where you have to race from New York to LA for $1 a mile, including buying the car and putting fuel in the car and the tickets you may or may not get. And so I did that several times. There's one where you have to do period correct cars called the C2C Express, and so we have to buy pre-1984 cars and drive those across. We took that Brock Yates Audi on it. It's just a race to the scene of the breakdown, but it's worthwhile. We did one that was called the Musket Ball, and everybody had to have less than 100 wheel horsepower. And at that point, I didn't want to build a car for it, because who needs another 100 horsepower car? But I rented a car, and you fly into the White Plains Airport, and I had them all set up. I was going to rent, I don't know, a Chevy Spark or something like that, and they were like, and it was normal darn bait and switch rental car guys. They were like, oh, we've got an upgrade for it. I don't want an upgrade. I want my Chevy Spark. And they put me in a Corolla, and I'm like, this is going to be a problem, because there was a penalty for every horsepower you were over 100. And I'm like, this is going to blow up in my face. And then I was like, wait a minute, CVT. And so if you can believe it, the 137 horsepower became 99 with the CVT garbage. And so don't buy CVTs. They're terrible, but they will get you under the horsepower threshold. We raced a 1976 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow across last year. We drove it, and we got it there, and it was great fun. So I've had a lot more. I think I've done it 9 times, only a couple of times really trying to go fast. Yes, sir.
Hey, I just want to say I love all of your content.
Thank you.
A few manufacturers have already kind of come up, Pininfarina, Rimac, Bizzarini. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you have a spiker yourself, and you talked about your experiences with Lotus, trying to sell Lotuses.
Yes.
Are there any kind of more like experimental cars, kind of like your spiker or something like that, that interest you?
So we were talking about obscure brands and how they come and go. And you know, I love my Spiker. I bought Missy Elliott's Spiker 3 years ago, and I love it. I almost bought yours, Ron, when you traded it in. I tried to buy it again last year. It was for sale. He had a Spiker C8 Spider. But you know, I think that it's amazing how many manufacturers have been able to go from zero to pertinent in such little time. You look at how few cars Koenigsegg and Pagani have made, and it's more than Spiker made, which is about 260 cars, but there aren't that many more Koenigsegg's than that. And you know, you see the enthusiasm for some of these more boutique manufacturers growing, and for all of the market movement that we have seen, none of it rivals Zonda values. It's unbelievable. Now, it's driven by people whose grandparents worked really hard sometimes, but it is a situation where the cars have gone, like 5 years ago, you could buy a Zonda all day long for 900 grand, $1 million. 3 years ago, 5 million to buy you the coolest one you could find. Now you can't touch like a Chinque for 20, and you're bidding against people who don't know how much money costs. And so it's really crazy what's happening. And I believe that, you know, the people who are generally my age grew up dreaming of Ferraris and Lamborghinis because there were so few of them, and now there are more, and you can own them and love them, and everything's great. But I think the next group of people is hypercar crazy. And so there's a big part of me that thinks that these are considerably undervalued because there are so few, and because there are now a group of people on Instagram that don't pay any attention to normal Ferrari or Lamborghini. And maybe that's, I don't know what it means. It's just different, right? And so I think that, you know, there's always going to be these trends, and I think obscure hypercar manufacturers are certainly the next thing to go proper nuts.
Okay, up top here, Ed.
All right.
Hey, Ed, thanks again for coming. It's really nice to get to hear your stories and listen to you chat, so thanks for that.
My pleasure.
The one thing you said that really surprised me was that you look for cars that have issues, as opposed to everything I read says if you want to get a used supercar, buy the most expensive one you can afford, like the nicest one you can afford maybe. So what things would you look for that you would say, if it's been in this, I would never buy it, or maybe I'm looking for these problems and those are easily fixable with something this expensive?
So he asked why I endorse buying the worst examples of the coolest cars rather than the traditional prevailing logic of buy the nicest one that you can afford. And certainly most collectors would have a very different opinion than I do. My approach hinges upon the idea that people are way too scared of relatively insignificant problems in cars. And I like to find a circumstance where I am bidding against the fewest people possible. And so, for instance, when I bought Missy Elliott's Spiker, Missy's mom wanted it gone suddenly one day, and I couldn't inspect it. She didn't know where the title was. She knew that it wouldn't start. She didn't know how long it had been since it started, and she didn't know why it stopped. And that is a very difficult situation to number a car. And so you just throw out a very low number, knowing that most people would just say it's not worth engaging in that type of a negotiation, and you bid it low enough that if you have to fix everything, you're still probably going to be okay. So that works if you're educated enough about the vehicle to know how much everything costs. Now, if I was to buy this car in that same circumstance, everything is so expensive that I would actually underbid myself enough to maybe even look foolish. That doesn't bother me, but they would say that I look foolish. And so I think that if you can learn enough through the research, through talking to the people that are familiar with the products and the platforms, in general, it is a way to minimize your cost. You're never wrong to buy the nicest car, but you will be limited on your upside. I live in the margin between unacceptable and okay. That is a profitable margin. Okay to good can sometimes be profitable. Good to perfect is never profitable. Okay, so if you want to own like a perfect car, don't start with an okay one, because it's really, really expensive to fully overcome all of those issues. But if you can tolerate, you know, every light being on and not always making it where you thought you wanted to go, this is the dream. Yes, sir.
All right, so obviously this Bugatti is very special to you. What's the one feature that sticks out and why?
So he said, this is a very special car to me. What is the one thing that stands out and why? You know, I think that the fact that the car was the coolest thing on earth when I was most impressionable about cars is it. I mean, the idea that it was the fastest car on earth and that it was just this unobtainium, ridiculous idea. The fact that somehow my life trajectory eventually intersected with the right credit score and circumstance to be able to have one in my garage is the pinch yourself dream where, I mean, I still walk out in my garage and go, it's still there. And I mean, I think that's really it. I mean, I love the power, I love the feel, I love the comfort, I love that it's actually a usable hypercar. And you know, when I get some better tires, I'll love the rest of the pedal range. Right now, it spins it easily. And so I think that, you know, when I was a kid and they announced this car, I'm like, oh, this is going to be amazing. I actually called a dealership in Germany because they hadn't built their U.S. dealer network out, and I made them give me an allocation for one in writing, and then I tried to broker a sale through an internet forum for like $100,000. This guy almost paid me, but he didn't. And so to me, it's just such a long-term dream of that you never thought was going to happen, and still probably shouldn't by anything that Dave Ramsey's ever taught anybody, but I made it work.
Okay. I think that's it. So I'd like to thank Ed, and we'd also like to thank Seth and Ron for being here. Thanks, everybody. And if you would like, we'll leave the doors open in here for another 15 minutes or so.
Of course.
And if you guys want to come down, take pictures or talk to Ed.
Sounds great. I'll be around. Thank you all so much for coming out, and be sure to support Savoy.